So welcome also from both of us. So when this huge opportunity to talk with Professor Grina was presented to me, I approached it with some care and delicacy, how to do it this right for all of us, and we decided to have in this following hour more or less casual talk about the current challenges in language policy and planning, as the title says. There will be some, we will try to address a lot of different topics, and I hope all of them will be interesting for you. So as some kind of introduction into the talk, I would like to say that of course, we can all imagine why the language policy policies are needed. So basically to manage how the languages are used, how they are learned, how they are valued within the society, to ensure clear communication, basically to promote social equality and protecting culture and linguistic diversity, of course. And you also are familiar with the evolution of the language policies, at least in Europe. So basically at the beginning of 20th century and before, European countries mostly used language policies for nation building and centralization, and most countries used one standardized national language for nation building, and they used it in education, in government, in public sphere. And then after the Second World War, everything was about human rights, pluralism, supranational bodies, and European Union and Council of Europe, they emphasize this pluralism and human rights and cultural diversities. Initiatives such as European Charter for Regional and Minority Rights in '92 aim to protect and revitalize minority languages. And in multilingual states, for example, like in Belgium, Finland, and in Switzerland, the language policies often involved this power sharing and negotiation between language communities. And now in 21st century, everything is about multilingual practices. European Union and Council of Europe, they promote multilingualism as a core value of Europe. They ensure that all, let's say, major European languages are legally equal, that they support policies that encourage citizens to learn at least 2 additional languages besides their mother tongue. Documents like Common European Framework for reference for languages set some kind of international standards for language teaching, learning, assessment. So this recent language policy and planning in Europe includes everything fostering intercultural dialogue, social cohesion, cross-border mobility. They are supporting all languages, national and minorities. They are celebrating linguistic diversity. So policy-wise, it seems that everything seems great and perfect. Would you agree, Professor Grina?
Well, before I do so, let me just say dobar dan. Kot si lahko predstavljate, ne govorim slovensko, which means no choice. It'll be in English, but with my apologies, right? So, and in addition to those greetings and apologies, I'd like to express a few words of thanks as well. Thank you to the Institute and its director, Professor Sonia Novak, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be in Ljubljana again, to see again old friends, because some of us go back a long time. And so when trying to answer Dr. Zorčič's questions, I'll try to answer them because they are difficult questions, most of them. Well, some are difficult and some are very difficult. And but I'll be, in order to try and answer them, I'll draw on some earlier work of mine, work together with some colleagues, because very often this is teamwork, right? And in case it's useful, we've prepared a list of references there, arranged by more or less thematically. And so, in case it's useful, because I will not have the time to go into detail, that's where many of the answers that I'm going to try and present today come from. And that's where there are more developments than what I will be able to say. So the first question that has been asked is everything fine? Is everything great and perfect? And whether I agree with that. Well, great and perfect, certainly not. But I think we can say that some progress has been made in recent decades. So if I go back, before any of us were born, I suppose, remember that, after World War I, and Woodrow Wilson came up with his 14 points. At that stage, I think it helped to make linguistic diversity, ethnic diversity, minorities, in a way legitimate, as they say in German, salonfähig, the sort of thing that you can talk about in polite society. It was sort of reinstated as something that you could seriously talk about in public discourse. And then, after World War II, there was a major reversal because of all the horrible uses to which things like ethnicity, language, culture, etc. had been put to use by the Nazis. And that meant that, everything was about universalism, and particularities or particularism was bad with a capital B. And then it took several decades to re-establish the Salonfähigkeit, so the legitimacy, if you want, of certain types of topics that have to do with linguistic diversity, connections between majorities and minorities, to talk about this more or less openly. And in this sense, to answer your question, we have made some progress, but that's progress that we would measure in decades, with some important milestones like the 1960 UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education was probably one of the first ones. The UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the CSC Copenhagen document. Then we have the Council of Europe's Framework Convention and the Charter for Regional or Minority Languages in '92. Same year, the UN Declarations of the Rights of Persons Belonging to National, Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities, etc. So we've got several way stations that go in the direction of, okay, the situation is improved. But that's just on one front, because in parallel, we have seen separate developments which reintroduced other strata, other layers of complexity. And I think one major development is the generalization of international migrations, which increasingly, many people like myself would tend to refer to as mobility, because we do have traditional migration, but not only. We have other forms of migration, which makes the pattern more complex, and therefore it may be easier to talk about a generalization or an increased frequency of international mobility that was probably abetted or helped or pushed by decolonization in the 1960s, by some of the economic consequences of the oil shocks in the 1970s. And then in addition to this, we've had technological change, which has made international communication and international travel way cheaper than ever before in relative terms. And all this means that the contact with difference and otherness, the presence of difference and otherness, has become far more usual, far more banal than was the case at the time of our grandparents. On the one hand, we do have a decrease in diversity because some small languages are dying out, and we all know this figure that, that's something, I think it's Ethnologue, or is it the UNESCO, that has come up with this figure saying, we've got around 7,000 languages in the world, and roughly one language dies out every 2 weeks because its native speakers simply pass away. So objectively, we probably have less total diversity than we had before, but subjectively we are confronted, most of us, most people are confronted with more diversity than would have been the case for our grandparents. Now, it is of course more pronounced in big cities that draw a lot of mobility. It's probably less pronounced in more isolated, more places in the countryside, and that goes for pretty much all countries in the world. But by and large, even if we have a decline in the objective amount of diversity there is probably an increase in the subjective diversity to which people are confronted with in their everyday life. And this means that this recreates challenges and forms of complexity which have to be dealt with. And to go back to your question, Sabina, it means that as soon as we come up with certain answers, new challenges come up. So it's a never-ending type of challenge, a never-ending type of work, and we probably have lots of things that we have to rework or look at under a new angle, largely because the traditional association between a place and a language and culture, this one has changed completely, and we're probably not going back. Right.
So what are, in your opinion, the biggest challenges we are facing right now?
Yeah, probably 4 of them. I mean, interestingly, these are questions that seem to be resurfacing in the minds of lots of people, because this is pretty much the question that I've received from a journalist just 3 weeks ago for a Swiss newspaper, asking pretty much raising the question you're raising. So I think the concern is probably everywhere. Of course, and there is one which is very central to the activities of the Institute here, is the long-term survival of small languages. Whether we're talking about Sami in the north of Europe or Gaelic in Scotland, Romansh in my own country, and then what do we do about this? How do we defend them effectively? How much resources should we devote to this? Can we, as democracies, can we accept the very idea of not doing anything for them or not doing enough? Now, these questions are extremely classical ones. They've been around for a long time, and in a sense, they lurk behind all the international documents that I've referred to a moment ago. But these questions, even though they are the object of lots of concern and attention, cannot be considered as completely solved. And there are situations which are probably more promising than others. And in some cases, even when there are apparently some resources in favor of those languages and possibly the ethnic communities that go along with them, the situation is far from being solved. I think there are 2 aspects of what I've just referred to as mobility. One of them, which concerns you more than me, because I come from a non-EU member state, but because of the association, the ever closer association between these neighboring states like Switzerland and Iceland and Norway and the EU, it concerns us indirectly, but it concerns you more directly, is the mobility that can be to some extent regulated by the EU institutions. This enables a form of mobility that creates new meetings, new confrontations, or new encounters with linguistic diversity. And how do you, and how do we, because indirectly we are affected by this as well, how do we manage this? What does it mean in terms of the presence and the visibility of other forms of linguistic, cultural expression in a certain place where these forms of expressions were absent? They used to be absent, they are now present. So it may be more obvious in certain areas where economic activity entails the arrival of lots of people. It's probably more visible in big cities, but then I think quite generally it seeps through in the social fabric of all member states. So I think there's a very specific thing there about how do we deal with this aspect of diversity. It's not usually mentioned as a big problem. I'm not saying it's a big problem, but I'm saying it's a big question, because much of the project, if we look in the future, much of the project of what Europe is or could become is linked to how we deal with this. And as we may have the time to go back into this later, I will not elaborate on this point too much now, but it does not necessarily mean full variety everywhere in an indiscriminate way. There is a stratification that is part of what stabilizes societies. So there is a very delicate balance to be struck between maintaining a specific sense of place in various places and at the same time embracing forms of diversity that may contribute to this sense of place. Contributing does not mean destroying or altering to, in indiscriminate ways. But we'll get back to this. So there is a very delicate point there, which is linked to a regulated or regulatable mobility. But then there is the almost unregulatable mobility that is linked to migration movements, coming usually from, third countries, les états tiers, as we call them in French, and this very often means, people driven away from their from where they used to live by conflict, usually conflict, but can be famine, can be other types of crises. So how do we, and increasingly, of course, because of climate change, there are lots of parallels in terms of what it means with the, in terms of the impact on diversity with the previous one, except the previous one taking place within the framework of European institutions can be regulated, whereas this one is almost impossible to regulate. So you do hear those calls very often, from usually from people working at the UN about we must come up with a form of regulation that extends to all forms of mobility. I'm not sure you can have the same type of approach to the regulation of mobility in such different circumstances. But even if these are different types of regulations, these different types of regulations have to be considered. So you have to think not just about regulating mobility in the EU context as part of a well thought out plan, but also regulating diversity that is caused by all kinds of sources that we can not control or only barely control. Nevertheless, we have to come up with answers to this. So that would be the third one. And I think the fourth one has to do with fluidity and efficiency in bi or multilateral communication. And this brings us right back to the fact that right now I'm using English instead of Slovene, and there I think we need to be very careful. Some people present English as a lingua franca. We all know it's not a lingua franca. We all know that lingua franca is a language or a form of communication that progressively stabilizes into a relatively established code, though it has fluidity, that draws on the codes, on the idioms of the various participants in the exchange. So English is not a lingua franca. English is a hegemonic language. And there is a lot of work on this by people like Robert Philipson, whom many of us know. So I'm not saying it should not be used. I think we should call a spade, right? And in the case of English, no, it's not a lingua franca. It's fine to have a language that can be used even if it's hegemonic in certain circumstances, but then it's important also to remember that not all circumstances are fit for the use of English. I feel reasonably okay, I don't feel too guilty or too out of place using English here simply because of the setting or the setup. The setup is that most of us, I'm not, and few of us are, I guess, native speakers of the language of English, and it's an efficient way for us to communicate. Good. But where I disagree is when I see my own university offering too many courses in English. I don't like that. I think it's a strategic mistake. And where I think it is totally unacceptable is when I see internal administrative communication in English at my Francophone university. That to me is an absolute no-no. But then how do you deal with this, considering that many people don't understand the problem? They don't even see that it could be one. And you have to tell them, well, look, this has all kinds of displacement effect. This undermines the legitimacy of different ways of approaching the same thing, and essentially it stampedes us into not just hegemony, but progressively uniformity. And this is where it becomes dangerous. We've all heard about those stories, usually from places in Sweden, and as a golden example, another one is the Netherlands, where apparently you have students or researchers who become incapable of describing, explaining certain topics, including their own research topic, through the medium of Swedish or Dutch. That is a problem. I think it's ultimately dangerous for all kinds of reasons that we can come back to. So the challenge there is to support multilateral communication, but this means without uniformization. It also means without exclusion, because in this case the exclusion is the exclusion of the people who do not sufficiently master the hegemonic language, and that's dangerous.
How good are the nation states in general in implementing these multilingualism practices in their national language policies?
Well, you know the old joke, right? I think everybody attributes it to. It's one of those jokes that Churchill was supposed to have come up with. You know, democracy is the worst of all systems except all the others, right? And the United States can always be counted on to do the right thing after they tried everything else. So it's same sort of thing there. The nation states are the bedrock of the international legal order, and I don't think we're about to replace it by something different. Lots of things are changing, and I think the changes that we're confronted with are connected to the topic we're discussing today. What's changing, however, is not really the prevalence of nation states per se, but I think first we do have a relative weakening of the nation states because of, it's one of my pet peeves, I'm sorry, but because of the development of social media. The development of social media, I think, alters the relationship to truth, and some people now say it even alters the relationship to reality. We can say that it may be truth or it may be reality. That there is a nuance there, but I think the way in which states as a collective mode of organization can operate is profoundly altered and possibly weakened by the development of social media. And it's not the social media per se that may be so dangerous, but the expectation or the notion that social media should be the measuring rod of lots of things. And this is why I get so irritated no end when I see the mainstream press and journalists, just by way of example, I remember a few years ago, or before the situation we're in now, let's say 15 years ago, I was hearing a journalist complaining that it was terrible that the members of our government did not have a Facebook account or a Twitter account, Twitter back then. And, can you imagine this? They don't even communicate with this. I said, well, I certainly hope that they don't. If they have something to say, you can do something called a press conference. This is how states should be communicating. And I'm profoundly resistant to the notion that social media should step in. I think this is a cheapening of the position of the state, not because the state is sacred, but simply because the state is the nation, and crystallized as the modern nation state is, I think, the least bad formula we have come up with as human societies as an essential element in public communication and in collective organization. And this cheapens it, this weakens it. I think let's use it to the extent that we absolutely must, but not more. There is together with this, there is a weakening of the public sphere, because the public sphere also then, as a result, gets delegitimized as a source of collective discourse, and here I'm specifically referring to democratic collective discourse. including, by the way, as a counterpoint to market forces. We are right now confronted with two types of challenges, essentially one coming from the far right and one coming from the far left. And democracy is under attack. Like, at my ripe old age, I can't remember any point in myself, in my lifetime where the extent of the danger has been such. So we do have the attacks from the far right, which use, among other things, all the complexities of linguistic and ethnic diversity to undermine democracies. We also have this from, and this comes in two variants. There is the nationalist variant and there is the market variant, sometimes called the tech bros. They will come into conflict soon enough. But right now they are, I think, allied as a definite threat on democracy. And there is also, and that changes, is very different from one country to the next. You do have threats, I think, coming from the extreme, from the far left as well. Not so much out of meanness as out of sheer stupidity. You can quote me on this one. I used to be in a sort of left-wing party, and I'm an orphan now, at least politically. And I find that the only solutions are in the reasonable center, and that means regularly coming up with discourses to fight back the far right, to fight back the far left, and try in a currently sort of narrowing, shrinking space to maintain certain types of voices in the favor of, supportive of reason, particularly when it comes to talking about linguistic diversity, because this is a weak spot.
So we had said already something about the English as de facto bona fide lingua franca. We have also problems here with English in higher communication. The motion of German, basically, no one's learning German anymore, but it's our huge economic partner and everything. Would you have something additional to say regarding that, or? Well,
I've already said, because I kind of jumped ahead of myself, because I know we decided that we were going to talk about this, and already mentioned a few points in connection with that. I think it's really, as a general rule of thumb, let's simply think in terms of using hegemonic languages, and currently English, in ways that may supplement but not displace other forms of communication. I think that's the main idea.
So why, in your opinion, projects like Esperanto or multilingual or receptive multilingualism are not effective in Europe?
Yeah, when I read that question of yours, there was a fascinating question. So really, thank you, Sabina, because it's really great material. And the question is, why do certain good ideas have such a hard time progressing? One of them is, it's called either intercomprehension, so the development of receptive skills in languages that are closely connected to those that you have as your L1 or one of your L1s, for those of us fortunate enough to have more than one. Or some colleagues have sort of run this into what they call LARA, lingua receptiva, so essentially receptive skills, even if those receptive skills are in a language which is not historically or otherwise connected to your first language. That is one of those things which I think is obviously something that we should support. And that's, for 20 years I've been teaching, I no longer do now, but for 20 years I was teaching not just in Geneva, but also in Lugano, in Italian-speaking Switzerland. And I had lots of students who were mostly either from Italian-speaking Switzerland or from Italy right next door. And then I used to give them the self-assessment grid of the European portfolio with the descriptors, 5 types, 5 types of communication skills and 6 levels. And I said, well, give yourself 1 point for every one of those squares that matches your experience. So I had young people, saying, "Oh, I've got 25 points in total, because as I exclude your first language, but all your foreign languages, right?" And few of them would, ever reach 48, 50. I said, you have much more than this, simply because as speakers of Italian, you probably can understand 90% of written productions in Romansh. Not far from that in Catalan. You probably reach about, say, 50% easily in Romanian, and so on and so forth. So you have a lot more than you think. This hidden capital is something that we should use. And I remember a meeting at the DG Translation many years ago, thinking about the possibilities of enlargement and the necessity to translate the acquis communautaire into languages like, Montenegrin, as distinct from Croatian or Serbo-Croatian. And I'm not an expert in this at all, but what was really interesting was that they were saying, okay, well, we're going to need to translate into those languages, but we'll also may need to translate certain things out of as part of the process. To what extent can we possibly bank on the proximity between those languages to be more effective in money, but also in time to make it faster? So I think there are enormous things there which we barely use. And then, of course, you have the constructed languages or planned languages like Esperanto. Esperanto is just the most successful, some people would say least unsuccessful, but I think, it's not bad considering there is about 5 million more or less proficient users around the world. And of course, it would be extraordinarily more effective economically to go in this direction, not just in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of fairness. Mm-hmm. So the sharing of the burden of communication. So why is it not being more successful? I have listed, I'll tell you the list of things that when preparing my answers I'd come up with. Stupidity, ignorance, alienation, snobbery, possibly vested imperialistic interests. And, all right, so I was probably in a bit of a bad mood, I guess, but anyway, no, by way of consequence of the above, there is hardly any institutional support for intercomprehension, for Lara, for planned languages, etc. And perhaps in connection with this, I think part of the explanation has to do with the fact that these things, because it's communication, and communication does operate as a network, you need some coordination. And there is surprisingly little coordination between the countries for whom it would be in their own interest to promote these kinds of solutions. So there is coordination in very specific contexts. I've mentioned DG Translation. We can mention the Common Interpreting Services of the EU. So you do have planned situations with coordinations, but these are actually exceptional in the sphere of language and communication. But having said all this about all those negative trends and attitudes and whatever, I was reminded of something called Hanlon's razor. So it's not Occam's razor, but it's close enough, right? And Hanlon's razor says that never attribute to ill will or to bad intentions what can simply be attributed to ignorance.
So, what about the new realities? You mentioned already about migration and everything, but do the nation states how do they tackle with these new realities? There is a huge debate around new minorities, old minorities, and basically the sheer numbers of them. Yeah. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I'm very hesitant to speak of new minorities. I speak of mobile communities, or communities resulting from mobility, migration if you want. Because I think on the one hand you have the situation of quote-unquote traditional minorities, linguistic, national, autochthonous, diasporic, etc. And you have the situation of migrant or mobile communities that result from either the duly regulated mobility that we talked about or the unregulated mobility, mostly from quote-unquote, again, third countries. And I think there is a difference between A and B, between the traditional and the migrant communities. It doesn't mean that no rights attach to migrant communities, mobile communities, but the nature of the rights and the, let's say, the legitimacy of those rights is not constructed with the same bricks. It's not the same materials. And we should, and this does not mean shutting out certain types of expressions of diversity, but it means remaining aware of the difference, because ignoring this difference has all kinds of dangerous consequences. Of course, this distinction between A and B is quite familiar to lawyers. I keep referring to definitions like Capotorti and Deschênes, and these people who do talk about a long-standing association with the state. That is, I think, relevant. It is also very clear in the EU Charter, in the preamble of the Charter. So I think this distinction needs to be borne in mind, because otherwise what you do get is a backlash, and the backlash can be extremely dangerous, and it is being exploited by anti-democratic forces.
And what about what can we do about the power relations among languages? So are the weaker languages, or let's say small languages, which are regarding speakers, or less supported languages who don't even they don't have speakers, no support for the digitalization and everything that has to be done right now? What's your opinion on that? Are they doomed, basically?
Not necessarily, but then it requires, I think, pretty careful analysis to, first of all, there we can quote somebody else there. We can quote Joshua Fishman, who said that if you are interested or concerned with the situation of minority languages, you have to row against the current, and he once wrote that rowing against the current is difficult enough as it is, but it's nearly impossible if you don't know exactly where you want to get to and why, for what reasons. So you need a lot of clarity with this, and of course each situation is unique, right? Each case is unique. In terms of a general answer to your question, what I tend to think is say, all right, we have, I think, 5 or 6 very important analytical distinctions which may be ignored by politicians, which may be ignored by journalists typically, and which most of the time are useful. One that we keep forgetting, and I think they're the problem. I mentioned the problem with the attacks on democracy from the far right and those from the far left. Those from the far left have a certain type of coloring to them. Specificity is the ignorance of the distinction between the positive and the normative. So it's really important at all points to bear in mind the fact that on the one hand we have to understand reality, just make the distinction between what is true and what is false, and then have a separate line of interrogation about on the normative plane, being able to make the difference between what is right and what is wrong. So, right is an ambiguous word because it has 2 different contraries, and we should not mix them up. The distinction between subjective and objective diversities, as I said before, what objectively, the amount of diversity or the range of diversity that we have may be changing, it may be decreasing, but subjectively, where most people encounter more of it, it's not the same thing. So lots of people are talking about the enormous rise of diversity, but without seeing that we're actually seeing a drop in it. But then, because they're shifting from one to the other. It's also important, I think, when we talk about what we want to do, to ask ourselves, well, if we want something, what is the point of comparison? And that's something that very often when people talk about how, about the cost or of translation and interpreting, it keeps coming up all the time. what is the value of having all those languages? Well, it's a very different question if you ask, well, what the alternative would be. Given that we live in a world that is currently multilingual, not providing the translation and the interpreting in the variety of languages that we have would imply that we are forfeiting all the advantages that we can get from cultivating this diversity. And so this is what we call the contingent or the conditional case, evaluating diversity given a contingency or under a condition, that the condition is that the world is still linguistically diverse with about 6,000 to 7,000 languages in the world. And the other question is what we call the absolute perspective. In the absolute, would humankind not be better off if humankind all spoke one language, a pre-Babel type of universe? So people constantly confuse the two questions, and they are deeply different. Incidentally, I think there is some value to linguistic diversity in the currently multilingual world, because there are market and non-market, financial and symbolic advantages to cultivating linguistic diversity through various strategies, translation and interpreting being some of them, language learning another of them. But then there's probably also advantages to linguistic diversity in the absolute, i.e. we would be worse off in a completely uniform world, because we do have results on econometric or psychometric results on the impact of linguistic diversity in a person and or in a team. And we find that the diverse individuals and the diverse teams perform better in various creativity tasks. So this suggests that by and large, if we did not have diversity, we'd be better off if we had a bit more of it.
So let's go to measuring language policies. How do you know if the language policy is good? How can we measure that? Do you have some examples?
Well, again, this raises the question of we can think in terms of benefits and costs, and that's a huge topic, and there are specific techniques to use there. We may not have the time to go into costing the whole notion of measurement and cost implies that we must simultaneously think of the distinctions that I've just listed, but we can add additional distinctions, such as the distinction between not just symbolic and material or financial, but also between the level at which we compute the cost. Do we think in terms of the average citizen, taxpayer, voter? Do we think in terms of the group as a whole? And the group can be humankind, or it can be a municipality, or it can be in between a state. So this means that depending on what you want to measure, how you want to identify benefits and costs, you're not going to be using exactly the same instruments. And some of them are available, many of them still have to be developed, so there's lots of work to do there. That's one reason why having an Institute for Ethnic Studies is useful. There's lots of work to do. But one perhaps general rule is that contrary, it's funny, I remember back from, I discovered all this when I was in my late 30s, early 40s, and I was, meeting people at conferences about minority-majority issues, and they were all about, we need examples of best practice. And, it increasingly was clear there was no such thing as best practice. All you can do is you can compare. You can say, well, we've got examples of relatively successful practice, relatively unsuccessful practice. We don't know if it's best, we don't know if it's worse, but we know that if we compare this with that, well, this seems to be a bit better for measurable reasons. And then what you measure depends on what you take into account. There are other things, other frameworks that are, you mentioned when, when we prepared those questions, you can break this down into sort of slightly more applied things like efficiency, fairness, and then there are some specific applications for example, on the labor, that travel through things like the labor market. And again, we can talk about these instruments, but that, I don't see time is flying.
I have one special set of, and I will bring it in one piece, the future. So what changes brings the AI regarding the policies, costs and everything, and also on the values of the European languages, and how do you see European languages in 50 years?
Well, of course, AI is a question that we're all everybody is asking. We're all asking ourselves what's going to happen. I think that what I like about it is that it can make linguistic diversity cheaper. It can make the work of translators and interpreters cheaper, among other things. And it doesn't mean we're going to replace and do away with the translators, but just give them tools to translate more, to produce more diversity. So what has to be carefully organized is what sort of, again, where, as Fishman said, where we want to get to. And I think in this case, if we are clear, if we have a good set of goals, then we can put AI to use for this set of goals. Having said that, the idea that AI would replace the human intervention in the production of communication across language boundaries or between people with different language profiles, this to me seems unrealistic, because we use language not just to, language is not just communication, and communication isn't just information transfer. Language is also something that we use to define who we are individually and as groups. A language is what we use to define not just who we are for ourselves, but who we are towards the other, which means possibly being in opposition with the other, but also being able to meet and receive and be host to the other who is guest. And this is something that for which language is something that we need to produce ourselves, not entrust just to a machine. Language is also what enables us to make sense of a complex world. It protects us against manipulation and anomia. And you of course, the one reference that we may all think of is Klemperer and the Lingua Tertii Imperii, the language of the Third Reich, where the manipulation of language is such that it undermines the very conditions of democracy. So I think it's AI fine, but with extremely close monitoring and bearing in mind where we want to get to quote Fishman again. So I think that diversity will remain valuable in contingent or conditional terms, as I was saying before. I think it probably because of the connections with invention, innovation, creativity, I think diversity remains valid and collectively, absolutely. But I think that, and this will logically remain unless societies, contemporary societies, are willing to really give up their specificity and give up their sense of who they are and identity. Some forces are pushing us in that direction. I have absolutely no trust in big companies, what we call the GAFAM, right? So that's a bit dangerous. As to what's going to happen to the EU and its linguistic diversity, specifically in 50 years, as you were asking, that's too far away for me to take the risk to say anything.
So thank you, Professor Grina, for your valuable answers. I forgot to say at the beginning that now it's also your turn. So basically you have the opportunity to ask Professor or to comment anything from this talk. So you're most welcome to ask us, or Professor Grin, not me, some questions. So now it's your time, basically. I kindly welcome you to,
Perhaps I will start. Please excuse my English. I'm from the French-speaking section. I was very glad to hear that you were saying that it's a big mistake if we would have courses in English. Mm-hmm. We have that pressure on the university at the University of Ljubljana to have more courses in English, but in fact we can see that the students that are coming to Slovenia, they are mostly from the former republics of Yugoslavia or from other non-English speaking countries. So we try to offer the learning of Slovene because they will need it if they study here, also for integration in the society after, because if they are studying here, we don't see that they will be going much abroad to English speaking countries.
So because I think there is, I think there is a bit of a fantasy in the minds of, I don't want to point the finger to specific groups of people, but it seems to coincide often with the non-academic administrators at universities.
Not really, it's more STEM.
Oh, okay.
STEM policy.
Possibly as well. There may be an interaction between the two there. But what I find is that if we see, usually it's because internationalization is invoked. And then internationalization is being confused with anglicization. And said, well, if you are really interested in internationalization, then you should avoid the concentration on one language. Except, of course, Slovene, because it's in Slovenia that you're going to find this unique contribution to linguistic diversity in academia, which is teaching in Slovene, right? Elsewhere, you can find teaching in English, but teaching in Slovene is only here. So it makes sense to offer Slovene much more than it makes sense to offer English. And at the same time, see, if you bring in people who don't speak Slovene yet, I can very well understand, as we do as well, to offer for the initial years of a degree some courses, not all, some courses in English, but progressively, so as to progressively ease the arrival of external students into Slovene medium education. But this is what we sometimes call the U-shaped curve, which is the U-shaped curve describes the maximum proportion of courses offered in a non-local language, e.g. in English, which can be, at the beginning of a BA program, about 20%. And then possibly in doctoral students, for doctoral studies, because you need very specialized teaching, it can climb back up to 50%, but definitely towards the end of a BA program and the first years of an MA program, that percentage should be close to zero. It should be exceptional. This is what we call the U-shaped curve. And this, in this sense, you can cultivate a form of diversity by encouraging for students to be there and ease their arrival. You can also encourage diversity by drawing on teaching forces that do not speak Slovene or whatever local language.
We already have it. It's called a year plus. So they benefit from 1 year more of the status of the student.
And at the same time, this reasserts the fact that you are interested in making it international. You want to cultivate diversity, and diversity means avoiding hegemony. So I think there's a few things about this in the Francophone literature, because it's a big problem there in the French-speaking world, right?
Thank you very much.
François, it's wonderful listening to you again. There are so many topics that you haven't touched upon and you could have. I would like to actually ask you about this last one, the future that concerns us all. What we've seen here in Slovenia is that quite a lot of potential students think, or their parents think, that the language problem is solved, which is reflected in a very low intake in traditional philological and translation programs. And I'm glad, I would first of all like to hear what's the situation like in Switzerland, but what our concern is not only, this existential concern, but also that people would seem to withdraw in this very close caskets of their own one language, and will in fact not be able to see the world from other angles, which the knowledge of some foreign language offers you. The broadness of minds, the democracy that you're talking about. You remember how Derrida, in fact, interpreted the myth of the destruction of Babel, saying that God forced us into democracy. And it is knowing that you're limited in your language and that you need to accommodate and step out of this comfort zone, in fact, makes us more open. How do you see that? I think it's a real danger. It's not just that we are not going to have people who speak more than one language, but it is a challenge for the whole fabric of our society.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Nikkei. That is, of course, major, an extremely difficult problem. Let me start with something specific, and then we can possibly run. You may remember the expert group convened, I think, in around 2010 by the Commission, and it was coordinated by the French-Lebanese dual national writer called Amin Maalouf. And I think it was that expert group headed by Amin Maalouf who said that, well, you need coordination, there again, the coordination between member states in the EU, of which there isn't enough. And this coordination should, among other things, consider the idea to embed into the education systems of all the member states something called the PAL, the personal adoptive language, i.e. saying, all right, teach a hegemonic language to people, but also get people to invest heavily, and also in terms of a personal relationship, in an exercise of identity building, invest in the language and culture of at least one other EU member state, not the hegemonic language, but another one. Irrespective whether it's a big language, whether it's German, or a small language, whether it's Estonian. As part of something which I think quite explicitly that expert group saw as simultaneously a safeguard for democracy, a safeguard for the conditions for the development of a specific European identity, which is part of the whole political project. Again, I'm saying this from the outside. It's easy for me to say. You probably have far more specific, a deeper understanding of this than I do. But I still think it's pretty important as part of a political project, but also as part of the conditions for democracy. So I think the problem has been identified, and some solutions such as this one have been proposed. And if in the face of it there is a retreat into a narrower sphere, as you were saying, and I sometimes wonder in the case of my students, what do they read? And do they read anything? Well, they probably, I'm sure they do, but frankly, I don't know what. That's all. Perhaps I just don't know what it is. But so, in order to do this, I don't know if there is anything more than we can do than making it through policy decisions, which requires a political will, making it always easier and cheaper in terms of money, in terms of time and effort, to access ways of being and ways of learning that are in favor of linguistic diversity. For example, developing in Switzerland, we should go into the direction of offering bilingual education streams. Not necessarily for early childhood, because we don't have the possibility, we don't have the Lehrkräfte, we don't have the teachers for that. But towards the final years before people go into their adult life and career, to offer bilingual streams. We should make this easier. We should make this cheaper. We should remind people of all the advantages that are connected to this. Some are material, some are symbolic, but that apart from repeating this all the time, creating conditions that make it easier. And I think we also need a slightly more critical discourse towards the ways of being that are presented as desirable in, for example, again, the social media. So I think it's possibly, it's probably a bit of a propaganda effort for the good instead of doing it for mediocrity. Mm-hmm. I know it's not a. I don't have a magic wand,
I know you know.
Frankly, that's all I can come up with. But I think it's definitely worth doing.
Yeah, actually, mine is mostly a commentary or a follow-up of the previous question, because I would like to come back to the topic of the digitalization, because we are saying that our first task, if you are talking about the language policy, is the long-term survival of small languages.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that, for example, AI especially, or other online environments are somehow dominated by those global languages. And if we are talking about these small or regional languages, usually there are some initiatives led by citizens or NGO. Then even, for example, they are alive because they are volunteers, not because they have the state support. For example, in April, I was in the Latgalian region, and the Latgalian is the regional language, and a lot of young people now, they are conscious of their identity, so they decided to, for example, open an online platform when they report different news in Latgalian, and this is not sometimes seen very good by the Latvian media, for example. And in this case, so my commentary actually is, if we know, for example, those practices like lingua receptiva or receptive multilingualism, but you already said people are ignorant, or there is this human stupidity. So even if we can reduce the cost, there must be those, I think, connection by the, let's say, politicians or the political sphere and the citizens, because otherwise, or the linguistic communities, because sometimes the politics is just written, and for example, it's not like people are aware, for example, of the importance of their maintaining their language, but sometimes if they lack, as I said, the state support, as for example, I don't know, this in Latgalian case, but there are also other cases. So in this case, we know that the resources are not infinite, so we can't really finance everyone.
Magical
And,
gatekeepers. Magical gatekeepers.
Yeah. Oh, so the Latgalian-Latvian situation is interesting. Where do we start? The
global
right. There are, you mentioned activists and people who are being truly supportive. So there are people who are in favor. You have people who are against and who always will be. What's interesting is all the rest in between. And if you think about, because that's where it's important to get support, and for such support to travel also, or to bank also on the involvement of political entities. And in the example that you've given us, one member state of the EU. And at the level of those authorities, it's not the only case, but of course, once bitten, twice shy, they are extremely sensitive to what might undermine the position of Latvian from any possible angle. And I think that's where you need to, as I said before, every case is a special case, every case is unique. There is no best practice in this case. The response to this must probably go in the direction of explaining or developing the case that support for Latgalian is not antithetic to support for Latvian. And actually, if you step back enough, goes in the same direction. I think this has to do with some of the blind alleys into which the ideology of the nation state has gone over the years. The idea of the unitary nation state is one nobody's against unity, but what does unity exactly mean? And that's something where the Swiss experience may be modestly useful. I'm perpetually surprised when I go to EU member states. First of all, France, which is next door. I can be in France in 10 minutes, and I do this a lot. So where you see French journalists and politicians agonizing over the idea, well, are we primarily French or primarily European? And then you turn around and see the Germans asking the same question, and to us this question is bullshit. Because we have this tradition, which is long established, of having the co-occurrence without competition between several levels of identification. One being the municipality, which in certain parts of the country is really the most important. Then we have the canton, or local region or province. Then you have the confederation. And then at some levels we do feel European. And never does anybody raise the question of the conflict or competition between these levels of identification. So cultivating the non-incompatibility is something that I think is, at this time, still strongly underinvested in the European context. And I'm always surprised by this, and this can play out at different levels. Germany, Europe, France, Europe, but it can also played out at the level of being a Latvian citizen who speaks Latvian, but who also speaks Latgalian, because for like 4, 5, 6 generations, this is what my ancestors have been talking. So working on and I think from the work on this non-incompatibility can stem a sense of identity that can be foundational for the European project. I think that has been largely underinvested. In Switzerland, we've invested this quite a lot because it's a country that prides itself. It's a myth. Who cares if it's a myth? The point of a myth is not to be true, it's to be useful. And, as a myth, the notion that Switzerland was built not despite its diversity, but through its diversity, it's constitutive of what it means to be Swiss. That's something that is pretty useful. So I think the European Union could go a lot further than it does now in that direction, and then alleviate some of the tensions, e.g. between, Nika and I remember some of our colleagues there who are the perfect representatives of the traditional Latvian oligarchy, nationalist oligarchy. But we see their point. We see, what they have been through. We can understand the insistence that they put on the prevalence of Latvian, but they have to be told, Latgalian is not the threat. The threat is not there. On the contrary, it can be part of the same project that supports your primary concerns as well. So I think a lot of discourse can be developed in that direction and support but perhaps I'm being too optimistic. But again, I guess this partly answers both of your concerns.
Yeah. No, I just said the case of the Gallian because I was there in Ukraine, but I think that in all different European countries we can see a similar situation when there are those initiatives or NGOs trying to maintain a small language.
Yeah,
and again, it's the same.
Yeah, and we always think of the Norwegians and the Swedes as such nice people, but the history of almost cultural genocide of the Sami is, my God, it's quite hair-raising for those of us who have hair.
So everything is very interesting. We'll have just one question because the time is already pressing us. Mitya, yes?
Thank you. François, it was excellent. And I would just like to comment on few issues that you raised because I really believe they are important. And I'll start with the last one that you mentioned. This is the concept of multi-ethnic, multilinguistic state versus monoethnic, monolinguistic, single nation state. And I think this is a very important distinction, and I do agree that here Swiss does offer a very good case, and especially it shows how identities are not simply and always just exclusive, but can also be inclusive. Namely, the Swiss identity was built as such. With regard to the Baltic states, I do agree with what was said, but I would also like to add that Russian is no problem. Even though they see it as an adversary, as a problem, as a potential threat, but actually Russian in those countries should actually be included in nation-building projects. in all of those countries. And my final, here I would like you to comment on that, and then my final question actually goes to addressing the issue of AI on one hand, and on the other hand, what is being called lingua franca or hegemonic language. Namely, all languages that were determined as lingua franca in the past initially were hegemonic languages that later on somehow mushroomed. The artificial languages, particularly, or new languages, particularly the one invented in Europe, were probably too Eurocentric to be acceptable worldwide. For example, when it comes to Esperanto, I've frequently heard criticism from Asia, a little bit more rarely from Africa, about its Eurocentric and Latin-based development. But what I would like to say is that large language models that are the basis of AI basically do not really build upon the fact that each language actually develops its own internal logic. And this is why multilingual teams are so successful in resolving problems, because they're applying these different logics that somehow develop through their linguistic skills, but not only linguistic skills, also cultural experience that a language carries. And I would like to ask you, how do you think it might be possible, particularly from the perspective of assisting interpretation and translation, to actually build in also these algorithms of specific logics that actually were developed through specific languages?
Okay, all right, sure. Right. As to the non-incompatibility between different strata, I think it's complicated. I think the PAL by the Maluf team and others can help us. We have lots of things to conceptualize there, but I think that there can be a relatively easy convergence there between people who have come from a priori very different horizons. So I'll skip over to the second one, which is about what you said about Russian. In theory, I fully agree with you, but in practice, I'd be very careful. My experience of Russia is very limited. I probably have less confidence in Russian elites than in Latvian elites to embrace that point of view, and you need both. So I'd say, why not, but tread carefully. And then I would say, tread extremely carefully. At this point, I don't think it's realistic. However, it must, I fully agree that the general ideal can be formulated, can be expressed, but then it means, again, what is the non-negotiable line is democracy. When has Russia been a democracy? Right, never. Simple as that. So, a couple months, possibly. So, so that is, I think, that's where we hit reality, which doesn't mean that reality cannot be changed. But the conditions for that change in reality must probably be built into a strategy, and otherwise, and that there's probably a sequencing that we need. And without this sequencing, I don't know if I would doubt if it works. As regards lingua franca, see, the original term lingua franca was never a hegemonic language. It was a language of merchants and sailors in the Western Mediterranean, possibly expanding to the Adriatic. I'm not sure about that, but we've got some. Yeah, we've got several quite a lot of research about the possible. Typical example is I think it was. Columbus. What language did Columbus speak? There is a chapter by someone in a book I've co-edited about what language did Columbus speak, and they talk about this merging of various things. So I'd say a true lingua franca may have been become hegemonic, but after it was constituted as a lingua franca, not as an import or an imposition. So even there, that's now, at the same time, there have been cases of imports and imposition, right? But, and you could say that's the case of English now, possibly. But I think that calling it a lingua franca is stretching things a bit. And by stretching things too much, we forget, I think, the real idea of the collaborative project that a lingua franca is. And finally, large language models, and how can large language models incorporate the sort of epistemic experience that is embodied in mostly natural languages? Frankly, if I were a computer scientist, perhaps I'd have an answer. Not being one, I don't have one. Thank you.